Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Gaye Massey, CEO of YWCA St. Paul. And on behalf of the entire YW team, I'd like to welcome you to the Equity and Justice Conversation on Economic Advancement. Thank you for taking time this afternoon to join us for this important conversation. We are really fortunate to have Tawanna Black joining us for this conversation. Tawanna is the founder of the Center for Economic Inclusion. It's the nation's first organization exclusively dedicated to advancing economic inclusion across all sectors in a major metropolitan area. I'm really excited to talk to Tawanna about what motivated her to launch the center and to learn more about the challenges that the center is tackling. After our conversation, we'll reserve a little time for Q&A. If you have a question, please put it in the Zoom Q&A at the bottom of your screen. The YW staff will share as many of the questions we receive as time will allow. Now, I'd like to let you know a little more about Tawanna. Tawanna is a nationally recognized thought leader, known for influencing, inspiring, and energizing and equipping cross-sector leaders to transform a personal conviction for equality into actions that produce equitable and thriving communities. For more than 20 years, Tawanna has led multi-sector collaboratives, triple bottom line diversity and inclusion strategy development, and economic vitalization organizations in Kansas, Iowa, Nebraska, and here in Minnesota. In 2017, Tawanna launched the Center for Economic Inclusion. As founder and chief executive officer, Tawanna leads a team of people who offer consulting products and services to move businesses and local and regional governments from diversity and inclusion programs to triple bottom line results that are good for employees, employers, and communities. They foster shared accountability for regional inclusive growth, and they work to change the narrative about the economic imperative and value of closing racial wealth gaps. I'm really delighted to welcome my friend Tawanna here today. Thank you for being here with us and for the important work you're doing in the Twin Cities, Tawanna.
Thank you so much for the welcome, Gaye. It's such an honor to be here with you. I'm so excited about the work you're doing at the YWCA and so excited to be here on the Zoom stage with you.
I'm thrilled to be having this conversation with you. So as we get started, you're one of the leaders making really significant impact on issues of racial equity here in the Twin Cities. Can you tell us a little bit about what moved you to engage in this work?
Absolutely, absolutely. The work to create the center has been a labor of love and a labor of pain. And I think as someone who's not a native Minnesotan, but has been here for 11 years, when I first called a group of colleagues and friends together with this idea that we needed a different type of organization in the region, I talked a lot about the pain point of economic growth and inclusion, and Minnesotans would say, you can't say that, like phrase it differently. But it really was this place of believing that while employers were having conversations about the shortage of talent and this increasing talent shortage and the need to find the right talent, I wasn't seeing behaviors that convinced me we were really experiencing a talent shortage. I was seeing behaviors that convinced me we were having a shortage of truth, a shortage of willingness to have hard conversations that moved us to hard actions, right? Hard actions around inclusivity and equity. Right. And we were masking that by having conversations about a talent shortage, because everywhere I saw lots of talent. I saw lots of people wanting to work, lots of people with great talent, and yet lots of jobs open. And so the impetus around the center was to say, let's shift that conversation. Let's shift to the conversations we have about how we value talent, whether it's someone who's seeking a job or some business owner who's seeking an opportunity to get a contract in order to then put other people to work, or someone who's seeking to be able to maximize land in a neighborhood that has been labeled as underutilized or disinvested, when really it's about undercapitalization and undervaluing. How do we change that and not only see it as a handout for Black and Brown people, but start to reposition that as really about reinvesting in communities where we've experienced wealth extraction. So really returning and repairing a value that needs to be returned and repaired, but also reshaping the narrative to be one that says that it doesn't only help the people in those communities, us, but also drives the entire economy, because the data shows that it hurts our entire economy every day that we allow the racial disparities and inequities that have stood in our community, every community across the country. Every day that we allow those to stand, it hurts all of us. So that was the big driver, if you will, was just seeing that over and over. The other piece of it, though, was personal, and that is I'm a mother. I'm raising 2 Black children every day. And while we're blessed and privileged in so many ways, there are 2 Black children in Minnesota who go to school in places where they could get an education that's really good, but often they are also seen as children who are less than, right? And they don't get the same considerations and the same investment. And every day I'm reminding them that if you don't try, that person is going to look at you as though you're not capable. And they have to hear 10 more speeches a day than they should have to hear simply because of the color of their skin. And so this work is not only for them, but for every child who looks like them, to be able to change those odds such that their brilliance is as valued as everyone else's.
Wow, that's powerful. You know, when I moved, well, looking at the disparities we've got in Minnesota, they're jarring. You know, we've got gaps around employment status, we've got a wage gap, we've got educational attainment gap, we've got career advancement opportunity gaps for people of color in this community. And it's not how most people think of Minnesota. So, you know, it's wonderful that you're doing this work, but for the folks listening, you know, you're talking about economic inclusion, which sounds to me like something bigger than just access to jobs. Can you talk a little bit about what that difference is?
Yeah, absolutely. For us, it's how we connect the decisions that are made every day inside boardrooms and hiring conference rooms and contracting conference rooms, investing conference rooms that connect to that access. Because for many of us, we have thought about it, right? It's just if we get the access to the job, that should be enough. But legally, right, there's lots of access, right? The door is open. And I'm a former diversity officer, and we often describe the difference between affirmative action, right, and diversity and inclusion is you can say I'm invited to the party, but the experience that I have after I get to the party may be drastically different than my peer if I'm not from here, right? Or if I didn't really get the full invite, I got the last minute invite. So how I'm going to get down is a little bit different than the next person, right? So this work of economic inclusion says, how do we start to peel back those layers of equity, and specifically of racial equity, such that it is about the behaviors, the policies, the practices, and the goals that we establish, and we measure it for the long haul, not an initiative. And that we don't only think about that access as, again, that hand up, but we also think about things like wage parity and equity, where in Minnesota, we have had gaps between Black and white workers who go to work every day in the same job classifications, but get paid differently for those same jobs. We've had stagnant gaps for more than 15 years. 15 years. And those gaps persist, whether you have a high school diploma or a doctorate degree. So this isn't about, oh, if people got more training or if they got another credential. No, this is about if employers stopped letting racism get in the way of paying people equitably. So economic inclusion starts to help us as employers and policymakers look at our stuff, our training, our education needs, and say, how do we unlearn racism by changing our policies and our procedures and our goals, and then fostering real inclusion. And the economics piece of it is to say, yes, it's going to change the economics for Black, Latinx, Asian, Indigenous people. And it's going to help our economy, because those social programs that we tend to think about through a philanthropic lens, we'd need a lot fewer of them if we were to have equitable and anti-racist practices and policies. as it relates to jobs and business contracting and housing, but we haven't solved for that. So we end up needing so many more social solutions to address our racism.
Yeah, yeah. You know, what you're talking about is so much harder than putting a new policy in place to try and encourage hiring a diverse workforce. I mean,
Absolutely.
because most people, we grow up in systems and they seem normal to us and kind of like the way things are and or even should be. And that's what you're challenging, really, how we, all of the systems that contribute to these outcomes we've had. And
Absolutely.
that's a hard lift for people. Um, you know, can you talk a little bit more about some of the policy and systems issues that have led to the extreme disparities in Minnesota and other parts of the country?
Absolutely. You know, and I think you all take this work on as well. And so I think it's important for us to start to peel back the layers to understand how we got here, right? So what has led to this, and whether it is those who have studied things like the color of law, right, and the color of money, understanding our housing covenants that have been put in place over a number of years. All of these policies have led us to this point. If we think about often from an employment standpoint, many people say, okay, well, we have affirmative action in place, right? Isn't that solving for it already? And affirmative action has its place and its role, certainly, in creating access. And it is incentivizing affirmative effort, right? It says to employers, you must put forth an affirmative effort in order to encourage people to be in the workplace and in the pool. And often employers will say to me, I get this with just about all of our clients, Tawanna, should we have something like the Rooney Rule that suggests to us that we should have a specific number of people in our pool, right? That we're not going to interview until we get a woman, or we get a certain number of people of color in the pool, then we'll make sure that we interview. And even those types of policies and procedures have done some good. And in other ways, they've done some harm in terms of the psyche and helping us really begin to value people at the same rate. So the work that we do is about helping employers, not just, to your point earlier, not just get a policy, not just get a goal, because goals, affirmative action help with goals, but to really start to get to the root cause of where did we start to believe that some people were worth less than others? Where did we start to learn that some people couldn't do the job that other people could do? And let's be clear, that Black people couldn't do the job that white people could do. That if they did do the job, they shouldn't be paid what white people should be paid. We learned that from slavery, the roots of slavery. And while some people would like to believe, okay, but we're past that, we're not there now, this is some different problem, it's not. The roots of that are still so alive in the minds of so many that they show up in things like wage inequity, where we tell ourselves, well, yeah, but I shouldn't pay that person the same thing. We have policies that say, you tell me how much you made at your last job instead of me telling you how much this job pays. Why? Because I want to be able to value you the way I want to value you, not pay you what the job earns. Well, that's how you end up with, I'm gonna pay you this much to do the same job as I'm gonna pay that person, right? A different thing. We have to get to starting to break down where we learn to value people differently, because if we don't start there, we'll create goals that don't actually address the roots of racism. And instead, we see this all the time. Our strategies, we say they're about fixing racism, they're actually about fixing Black people. They're about fixing brown people. You can't fix something. I'm not broken. You're not broken.
Mm-hmm.
But we have solutions that actually, if you break them down, they're written as though we're fixing the people. The people are suffering from the symptoms of racism that show up in our employment systems, in our housing systems, in our business development systems, and on and on and on. And there are lots of systems. With 400 years worth of this stuff, you'd expect us to have some symptoms, right? Some carryover systems. It's in our blood. They've proven it's in our DNA of blood. And yet, we haven't chosen to invest in racism. Our work of economic inclusion says, nope, let's go right to that root cause. Let's unlearn those things that we have been taught. Even us, we've been taught, well, I got to work harder in order to get there. Says who? Let's unlearn that over and over and over, because you don't unlearn it through one training or one workshop, right? Let's unlearn it, and then let's build the policies around that unlearning to check it, so that when it comes back up, because it's hard, it's muscle memory, when it comes back up, we can check it and put some accountability in place. and then measure the economics of it over time to be sure we get to that income and employment and wealth parity that must be achieved.
It always surprises me, what you're talking about are kind of the badges and legacy of slavery. It created systems in this country that have gone through cycles. Slavery, then Jim Crow. I mean, these things creep back up in really innovative new ways.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
and enough so that we don't always recognize these cycles and what has happened and how these understandings and values about people have been perpetuated over centuries. That what you're really pushing is the hard work, but it's the core work that really has to happen for real change, I think. Have you been surprised by anything you've learned about our community or the response to inequities as you push for this work to because this is hard work to achieve real economic inclusion?
Yes. Yes, and I think every day brings some surprise or another. I think there's surprises at both ends of the spectrum. I'm surprised sometimes by, Minnesota, we have some of the best of everything and we got some of the worst of everything, right? We've got the best parks and the best businesses and the best family, we win the awards for everything. And we're known for progressive values. And that can be so masking of inclusion. And so for many, that set of values and all that it has brought for good has made the reckoning with the depths of racism very hard. So even for people who find themselves being huge supporters of the work we do, the work of dismantling institutional racism, when you start to talk what I'm talking, of breaking down these systems, of talking about where racism shows up in our four walls, where it shows up in those who want to invest in our work, but are still perpetuating the roots of white supremacy while sitting across the table from a person like me, right? That's painful because now it feels personal. Wait a minute, I'm not racist. Like I'm your supporter. I love you. You're not, you just don't want to listen. Well, what does that mean, right? And so sometimes I think that is surprising. I would also say, and my team and I, we're going through a training right now on anti-racist results-based accountability. And the trainers are challenging us about where does white supremacy show up in our leadership? Where does white supremacy show up in Tawanna's leadership? Where have I adopted the practices of perfectionism and paternalism that I have been taught by white people, right? That show up in my leadership. And it is most interesting when my white staff say, Tawanna, nobody else has to do that and has to be that perfect. And I'm like, well, but we do.
It's what you've learned, but also survival strategies you've been taught by your family.
Absolutely. We do. He'll get it done because we do. That's the only way we're going to survive, right? And so now having this trainer say to me, white trainers in anti-racist RBA say to me, no, you need to unlearn that. Like, well, how do you keep the doors open, right? Like, so those things about like, okay, I'm an organization that helps employers undo this. I want us to do better. Like, okay, the mind pieces of this, right? And yet I know with everything in me that is the core of the work that we have to be doing if we truly want to get to economic justice and freedom.
Yeah.
We have to be willing to have those tough conversations that make us uncomfortable, where we say, can we really get that free though? Yes, we have to be able to get there. If not in my lifetime, fine, in my children's lifetime, but I have to be willing to risk the friendships, to risk the conversation, to say, if we really want to go there, we have to be willing to go there in these conversations and relationships. And I'd say on the flip side of that, I'm surprised by the people who have those awakenings on their own, who have the awakening that says, I am your not just ally, I am in solidarity with you. And therefore I want to wake up every day and say, what am I going to do today to be anti-racist? What am I going to do today to not just take risk, but to live deeply within this and not rely on you to tell me what that looks like? right? And those people who are just in it all day long and are willing to fumble on their own and still get back up and do it again. I'm so amazed and so grateful for the wide number of people out there who just find their way in this work and walk arm in arm with us, not just elbow in elbow. That is what gives me the strength to get up every day and do this work alongside our team. And it's just amazing.
Yeah, yeah. You know, your center is involved in policymaking too at the state and regional level. Um, Tell us a little bit about your policy priorities for the next couple of years.
Absolutely. We have an amazing policy team by Andrea Firstan, and we've been working in this policy space more at the local level for the first few years. I'm working with city and local governments on their long-range comprehensive plans, and working with Ramsey County and City of St. Paul, and Minneapolis and others on those plannings and how to really center racial equity, and in particular, how to center Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Asian people in that planning work to get to wealth building. And now we move more deeply into the state level, where everything we do is that data-informed lens, and we're really zeroing in on a couple of things. The first is a racial equity impact note, where we are working with legislators to ensure that they have the tools that are necessary to be sure we scan every piece of legislation to say, how will this impact the communities that we say are most important in our state because of the history that we have experienced here? How do we center those populations and have the tools necessary to say, either this is going to move the needle on inequities or it's not? How is it going to move the needle? And then measure that over time. And that racial equity impact note, if we get this bill passed, would then become legislation. It would have a committee of folks, both from the public and state staff, who would work together to then implement that tool and have it moving forward. And we think that is very important. We're working in partnership with many community-based organizations and residents to be sure that that is something that can drive our legislation moving forward. That for too long we've tried to hope it sounds good, it's got racial equity words, or it says Black, or it says Latino. Nah, we need to know the data is going to move the needle, and especially when we're talking about the significant amount of dollars that are moving. So that's one. A second is around our workforce development dollars and being sure that as that program is retooled, those are dollars that come from employers and are used to be sure we put people back to work, that we continue to see a retooling of that toward family sustaining jobs and dollars going into the hands of organizations led by people who look like them. So Black-led organizations having dollars to have their own solutions. We say that, right? The problems are where the solutions are found. The dollars have to show that in a representative amount. And so we want to continue to push that. We've been advocating for that for several years since Governor Dayton's administration. We want to continue that heavy push, but particularly with that lens toward family sustaining wage jobs. Like we've been heavy in that space. We want to continue to drive toward that end. And then continued partnerships as well as it relates to higher education, having that interdisciplinary focus, that housing, higher education, workforce, it all goes together. People don't live their lives in the silos that our funding tends to be in. And therefore the organizations like yours and others who serve them can't afford for the dollars to be so sliced that they can't ever get a full family to the economic thriving place that they're trying to get to. And so we'll continue to push in those ways as well to be sure that not only does the state have the systems and tools they need to program across silos, but that they're also putting resources out in a way that does that.
What do you think the implications are for the Twin Cities economy and just our society if we don't act with real urgency on these issues?
You know, the dollar piece is huge, right? So whether it's McKinsey data or it is Accenture data, the data makes it clear that we are leaving billions of dollars on the table by not closing racial wealth gaps. That whether you look at Accenture data that suggests that if employers were to just narrow the perception gap between employers who think that they're creating inclusive workplaces and their employees who say not quite, you could add $100 trillion into the economy, right? Or if you look at McKinsey data that says if we would solve for the racial wealth gap by 2028, we could add significant dollars into the US GDP. But putting the dollar piece aside, because often we're known for, okay, the Center for Economic Inclusion, dollars. What I hear today more than that from employers from everywhere, not just here in Minnesota or the Twin Cities, we're in St. Cloud, Duluth, but Connecticut, everywhere that we go, is people who are saying, you know, I have a deeper level of consciousness now. Unfortunately, it took George Floyd being killed at the hands of police who are paid to protect him, for a lot of people to wake up. But if his life had to be taken, then I pray that it was taken not in vain, as we begin to wake up, and not just wake up for a moment, but truly wake up and take deeper action. And I'm hearing people say, this must change for my grandchildren. It must be change for my children, and I'm willing to lose something in order for it to change. And I think that's what we are risking right now, is our children accepting a world we've allowed to stay for far too long, accepting that there are these different bars that stem from the roots of slavery, that there are these different values on lives. When we say Black Lives Matter, that it doesn't really matter, that my life doesn't really matter, and that other people have accepted that my life doesn't really matter at the same rate that theirs does, even while they raise their children and read little books that say everybody's equal, or hand out money that said, "In God we trust," that we don't really believe those things. That's what's at risk right now, is that we will perpetuate evil in the name of good. That's too much. It's too much.
Yeah. I think we've seen after George Floyd's murder and the protests that followed, a greater focus on racial inequity in our community than I've seen in years. How do you think we sustain this focus? Because the kind of work you're talking about is long-term, hard work, not something we can do for a few weeks or a few months or even a year or two and feel like, okay, I'm tired now. I'm gonna move on from that. How do we sustain this focus to get where we need to go?
I ask myself that question at least a couple times a week, knowing that as heavy as the weight is on people like myself and my team members and our peers in organizations like yours, and our freedom fighters in organizations like the NAACP and the Urban League and others organizations, locally and nationally, I think it has to get to, and this sounds cliche, but it's so real, when I know enough about the plight of my next brother or sister, that I don't just know it from a annual report level or a headline in the news level or a tweet level, but I know it enough to feel it in my heart. And on May 29th and 30th and 31st and June 3rd and June 6th and July 4th, we felt pain and fear in our hearts that moved us to take action, some of us.
Mm-hmm.
The sustainability will rest on the extent to which our consciousness keeps us there, right? And the studies show that while many in our country, white people in particular, were moved enough to write checks and read articles and take surveys through this summer, by September, the vast majority, over 60%, had not done anything else. And right now, corporations have created a drastic number of diversity and inclusion positions. Nonprofits, even in the Twin Cities, have created a drastic number of chief inclusion and equity positions. I can't hardly hire people because everybody's getting hired to go be a new director of diversity someplace. However, in March of last year, those very positions have been cut by more than 60% in corporate America. The need for them didn't change that much in the last 12 months. Our consciousness on the surface level changed. And when I say our, I don't mean mine. I mean people in power who don't look like me. So therefore, sustainability will all rest on how close we get to the pain of Black and Brown people. Because the reality is, while this may have been the most broadcast murder at the hands of police, it was not the first. It was not the first in Minnesota. So until we get so close to that pain that you feel it every day, we all, sustainability, and therefore I think when others look around and say, well, why are they apathetic? Don't they see what we're doing? Why are they upset? What? Well, because history says too many of us don't hold on to the pain of others long enough for us to take and sustain drastic action, and action that's different than what we've done before. Because to your point, jobs program versus drastically different, justice program versus drastically different. Like, we've done a whole lot that didn't get to truly valuing lives the same way.
You know, I sometimes think that unless you kind of move out of your bubble, and all of us live in bubbles of some
We
kind,
do.
and really connect with people who live a different experience, it's hard to sustain that. Because kind of, if you're in your bubble, your views, your feelings, what's important gets reinforced by the familiar, what's always been there for you.
Yeah. I love that. If I could just, and I'm sure because people on this are they're your fans, your partners, so they know it, but if I could give just an example for folks, my work, most of my career has been place-based work. I love neighborhood and city-based work. So I've done a lot of neighborhood work in my career, and I'm a horrible asthmatic. If people can't tell, it's a bad day for me health-wise. So usually you could tell it. But I spent a good part of my time in the Twin Cities focused on North Minneapolis before I started the center. And on my worst asthma days, I would be fine at home. But as I crossed into the north side to get to my office, my asthma would change drastically.
Wow.
So my consciousness about things like plants that needed to have been shut down years ago, my consciousness about where dollars for those plants when they get shut down should go is drastically different when I am actually driving into that neighborhood every day and I have asthma and I know what it's like to be a person. Is different than it is if I just work in my bubble living somewhere else, right? Or even if I live there, but I don't know that it's not like that for everybody else.
Yeah.
If I don't know that, wait a minute, you don't feel this if you're not there all the time. You don't, right? You just don't know because you don't know what you don't know. Because you live in that all the time and you just think, well, wait a minute, I'm supposed to just feel this way all the time. No, you're not. And that's why we place places that can contaminate the air in low-income places where people won't know and won't question until it's far too late and the costs are far too great. So our consciousness level for us to stay close to the issue so we don't forget, stay close to people so we don't forget that. And I need those triggers and you need those triggers. We all need those triggers. That it's easy sometimes when it's race to just say like, no, I feel the pain. I read the article. No, it's different. And I think whether it's me who works on economics needing to be reminded of the work of my climate friends or my justice friends or my education friends of like, no, what is it actually like today? So we don't lose sight of the struggle and the feeling and the emotion, and we all stay arm in arm in it because it's too heavy to lift alone.
Oh, so I mean, that is just so true. You know, I'm going to ask you one more question, but I want to save some time for Q&A. So one more, and then we'll move to the Q&A. You know, many of the people who join these conversations that YWCA St. Paul hosts are really interested in building more equitable communities. And I know many people on this webinar are really interested in what ideas you could share around how they can help. You know, how do we achieve more equitable employment and asset building opportunities for people, for all Minnesotans? Just what can you share with them about, you know, they may not be a CEO. What can they do to make a difference here?
You know, I think the good part about this is that all of us have a role to play in our families, on our block, our places of worship, our places of play. If you're working, then you have a role to play on your job, even in this Zoom environment. It starts, I think, with continually increasing our education, of not turning a deaf ear or a blind eye to what is around us, and having that kind of insatiable yearning for knowledge and information, but also a willingness to interrogate our own ways of being and operating in knowledge. And I used to teach a class where I talked about where did we learn our cultural programming? So where did you learn the things that you know, that you believe, that you hold on to? Some of us, we got it from TV, we got it from teachers, we got it from grandmas, aunties, and uncles. But interrogate that stuff, because when those triggers come, they cause you to say something in your head about somebody or think something or make a decision. Interrogate, just where did I learn that? And do I know it to really be true? Have I had situations that prove that? Or am I just holding on to that? Or have I had enough to really make that empirical evidence? Or am I just holding on to that specifically as it relates to race? And begin to challenge and undo those things. Have more conversations with people to undo the things that show up as systemic racism in your day-to-day circle, and encourage others to do that as well, whether it's your children. My kids are small and I have to check them on things. Where'd you get that? Where'd you learn that? Hold on. No,
Right.
no, let's undo that, unwind that. No, not gonna do that. Nope. Or myself, they say something, I get, hold on, nope, let's unwind that. Mama shit, nope. Let's unwind that, because it takes all of us doing those things. And then I would say the wider your circle is, or the wider your sphere of impact and influence is, the greater your responsibility is. So then multiply that times 10 and say, okay, now I have a greater responsibility to use my platform to go share even more, to share this knowledge, to use it for decisions I do have control over, decisions I can influence. If you can move dollars, if you can move time, if you can move resources, you can get closer to a community, go do that. Go use whatever you have to move the needle, and don't let us stay where we are today.
Oh, thank you, Tawanna. That's just so well said. I mean, I think you've given us all a lot to think about, and really challenge us to do what we can in our individual spheres of influence. I mean, that's what it's going to take from all of us to move the dial. I want to now open up our conversation to address any questions from our audience. If you haven't already, please put your questions in the Q&A. And I'm going to ask Dina for any questions we might have.
Our first, oh, go ahead, Dina. Sorry. Our first question is, when there's finally a real reparations proposal sent to the powers that be, is there anything in regards to this topic that could be included or implemented in that proposal?
Great question. We see right now the city of St. Paul considering a reparations proposal of sorts. And we also know that certainly our federal government has been exploring various reparations proposals, and there are many groups who have considered those as well. Our own local Minneapolis Federal Reserve Board has had a couple of the best experts on reparations come in and speak. Sandy Darity a couple of times, who's an excellent expert on this topic. I think one of the things that's important for us, particularly here in our local context and with you all in the YWCA of St. Paul, to be conscious of is the importance of, as we think about reparations, particularly for African descendants of slaves, to be conscious of what is our intent for reparations. And so as we think about this particular community and being able to think about where was land extracted, where was wealth extracted, and there's a statistic I won't get exactly right today, but there is data to show what we could do if the wealth that was extracted from African Americans when the highway went through the Rondo neighborhood, if that wealth was returned today, just what would it do for those families alone? And it's significant. And so, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of sometimes we apply social solutions to systemic wealth extraction, we think about like, oh, children aren't educated. Well, where did the roots of that come from, right, in terms of wealth extraction? So I think a reparations proposal will need to be very specific about populations who have experienced wealth extraction. Many get caught up in the hangups of, okay, well, who's paying for the price now as opposed to who paid for it then? I think that's touchy, but it's important to acknowledge history as we think about reparations and using that word specifically, and the desired end. if there's going to be an end, or if this is solely going to be about repairing harm. And I think it's important to separate reparations from efforts that we see in other communities about reconciliation and truth. That is a different topic. And so I often just call that out for individuals who are considering such.
Thanks, Tawanna. Do we have any other questions?
We do. The next question is, when working with an organization or individuals, what does success look like?
I think a couple things. So we actually outline a few indicators as it relates to success. So we work with employers and policymakers in our core work and really work with them first from a structure of thinking about what are the goals that you can establish and how do we get everyone bought into those goals. So goals in talent, in procurement, purchasing, and supplier diversity, investment, public policy, and philanthropy, and then something usually tied to their core business. So if it was a nonprofit, your core results, or a for-profit, their core business lines. And we try to look at all of that to say, at the end of the day, how are we closing racial employment, income, and wealth gaps? Because we could have a whole lot of activity and not actually move the needle there. So our clear line of sight is there. For individuals, we look at what are the behaviors and actions that we're taking, and how are we doing those actions in ways that are anti-racist. Often our minds have been taught to say, well, I'm not racist. That really takes us into a place of arguing about subjective behaviors or not. And if we go to a place of anti-racism, then we look at what are the actions, again, I have a sphere of control over, and say, how do I take actions every day when I wake up in the morning that are anti-racist, right? So I know the things that are going to have racist implications or results. How do I make sure I do the opposite of those? So if I have control over where I'm going to spend my dollars, I'm going to look to put effort into spending those dollars with businesses that are Black or Indigenous or Asian or Latinx owned, right? I'm going to be hyper vigilant about that. If I have opportunities to hire people, I'm going to be hyper vigilant about that in my efforts. I'm going to take extra efforts because I know I'm trying to close a specific amount of gaps. I'm going to be extra vigilant about my inclusion and equity. I'm going to be extra intentional about my learning about communities that I haven't known a whole lot about. I'm going to be extra vigilant about understanding history and racism and slavery's role still in today. So that hypervigilance around anti-racism are the goals that we'd have an individual think about in terms of not only their learning journey, but how that learning then plays out in the actions we take on today, and how we do so in accountability, in shared accountability, such that people can hold us accountable and say, you know what, good effort, poor impact. So let's work on the impact piece of that, because often we rely on our intentions, but the intentions only count so much as the actual impact of those intentions has the result we desired.
Can either of you share any advice you would have for someone who's new to DEI work?
Any thoughts, Gaye?
Well, I think I'll repeat something you said, which is education and learning. You know, one of the things I think is hard for folks who are new to this space is understanding why things are the way they are. They haven't been taught the history of this country in school as it pertains to the impact and legacy of race oppression in this country. And so you don't have that framework for understanding why things are the way they are. And it's so easy to misunderstand why people are suffering the way they are or behave the way they do because you don't have a framework. So I say start with education, learn the history, learn how to connect the dots between policies and the disparities we've got right now, and the way we are taught to view the world. And I think you have been, Tawanna, really articulate about that tonight, that we grow up taught certain frames about what the world is, what's normal, what's not. And we've got to challenge so many of those frames, so many of those assumptions, because we're we do not have a society that values all people equally. And so we have to challenge the, all of our assumptions. So I'd say start with that learning, understand that equity and inclusion are different and than diversity. And I think so many folks who begin to learn in this space focus on diversity, and in a employment setting that's around recruitment, or it's around, having faces of color around, but not getting to the inclusion and equity pieces where you're ensuring that people are valued, their input is truly valued, they are welcome, treated as welcome. And systems are built so that their experience is supported and positive in the way everyone else's is. And so that's how I'd say to start. So Tawanna, if you have any thoughts to add.
Yeah, I think you really summed it up. I love that piece about the systems being built for people to be included and experience the system in a way that includes them. And I think when we acknowledge that the system was built to produce the results it's producing right now, often we think like, okay, wait a minute, maybe something's wrong. Like, no, actually it was built to be exclusive. Our founding fathers were not designing a system to work for everyone. And so it's producing that system, and it's been tinkered with around the edges from time to time over generations. The problem with that is tinkering doesn't produce the system. I compare it often to cooking, right? Is that you cook something and it doesn't taste so right, and then you try to add a little something, try to add some. Occasionally that works. Occasionally. If it's bad, usually you just need to throw it out and start again. And so that's often what we're talking about, is that when systems have been designed to exclude, for us to think that we could just tinker a little bit here and add a little line there about diversity and a nice little inclusion program and a parade here or there, and that we're going to therefore see people be able to pull themselves up by the bootstraps and get along, and it just is not realistic. And the problem with that is then against those mental mindsets, and we subscribe to FSG's 6 levers of systems change. You have to also change mental mindsets, right? Because then they get reinforced by that, because over time, then people were taught like, oh, well, if they're not making it, it must just be them, because we've tinkered with the system. We keep adding programs, and we've added lines to the rules, and we've added legislation, and we've added this. And so if they still aren't doing as well as we are after 400 years, it must just be them. It truly must be their DNA, like we thought back then. No, it was always designed such that people would be excluded. And so at some point we have to pause all that tinkering and say, okay, wait a minute, what would the system look like if we wanted everyone to thrive in it? And who has been excluded from that? And so how do we start with them and say, how do we, after all these years of having those folks excluded, how do we start with them and say, what would a great system look like for those folks? And I see a question about the 20-year blueprint. Like, that's what we're doing now with both companies and city governments and county governments, is saying, let's design a system for them, because we know, and that's targeted universalism. We know if it works for these folks, then it will work for everybody else. It has to. But that's hard work. To your point earlier, it is hard work. But it's also beautiful work, because you can imagine, like, wait a minute, this is really going to produce amazing outcomes for everyone.
Yeah, and nothing really, really good is that easy. So we want the good outcome. We need to work for it.
Yeah.
Dina or Nikki, any other questions?
Well, since you, Tawanna, just spoke about the 20-year blueprint, there is a question of what are some key economic inclusive practices that families in the 55102 area could develop in a 20-year blueprint with a 50-year vision?
So I love that question in particular, because I think it's from Zachary. You noted that families could develop. And so I love this coming directly from families in the 55102 zip code. And I dropped a note in the chat, and I'm hoping that a team can maybe share it out with everyone who's attending. On our website, we have something called the Indicators for an Inclusive Regional Economy, and it's made up of 14 indicators that cut across many different dimensions. We started with a big group of people a couple years ago. We've studied everything from the Rockefeller's got 160 indicators of an inclusive regional economy. We've studied the World Health Organization's indicators. We've studied a lot of them, but we cut it down to 14 because you need a smaller number that help us understand not only what's happening at a regional level, but also indicators that employers and policymakers and nonprofits and others can take a role in and that matter inside families. And we marry these with a larger set of indicators of household financial security. And I could share those out, though I may already use them, I don't know. But we'd encourage you to look at those and share those, spend time with those 14 indicators that cover things not only about education and banking practices and business practices, but help us get a real picture of what's happening. And on our website, you can zero in on not only zip codes, and some of them you can zero down to the census tract level to see how a particular neighborhood or community is doing. We'll be refreshing those with new data that comes out next month to zero in even further with a refresh of that data. But I'd encourage thinking about that 20-year blueprint and 50-year vision to say, what do we want this zip code to look like? And what do families want it to look like? And what's possible? I think often when we start with a family or a neighborhood, in my experience, we sometimes get the vision, but then we're hesitant when policy folks come in like, well, but that's not possible. We can't do that. We can't do that. With these indicators, this isn't just about bricks and mortar, but this is what is possible and what policies have to change. In our work at the center, we work every day with employers and policymakers to say, what do you have to do differently to make that change? And simple things and not so simple things. For instance, what I lift up for you is where you'll see a measurement there on housing affordability. And it turns out the Twin Cities, that's bad for all races. But we work with employers to say, do you know how many people inside your business are housing cost burdened? And what could you be doing about that? Could you have different benefits that would help your employees with their housing costs and rental costs? Could you have different benefits so that you often do that with upper income employees? Could you do that with everybody so that housing costs would be more affordable for folks? Could you use your policy arm to be able to address public policy in a particular zip code where you see you have a large number of employees who are struggling with that? Banking practices so that small businesses grow and rise in a particular zip code that are going to meet the needs of that business. And so I'd encourage those indicators as a great place to start. And then also listening to those families in that zip code about what indicators of household financial security are not, thank you so much for posting those, are not thriving right now, and where could you lean in, and where do you need others to lean in from an equity perspective? And the way those indicators are laid out, everything is through the lens of racial equity and disaggregated, because it's important to understand how are different racial and ethnic groups faring, and not simply saying people of color versus white, but like really understanding where do we have a need to really be laser-like focused.
Thanks, Tawanna. I think we have time maybe for one more question.
I'm going to summarize a few questions that have come forward, is really trying to look at an example of an organization or a company that's doing this really well.
Great question. I will use one that just made an announcement today as an example for you to look at. I think I get that question all the time, and there is not a company that I would say has everything right and has kept it right. There are highs and lows with every organization, and hopefully there's not one that also has everything wrong. But I'll highlight US Bank today made a major announcement about a project they've been working on for quite some time. If there's any US Bank folks out there, I'll give you some love. But Greg Cunningham, who has been leading the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Department there, Zach Boyers, who leads their Community Development Corporation, and Ray Badaminsky, as well as many of their team members, have been partnering on this. And I will say also with the support and leadership of their CEO, Andy, they came, probably about 11 or 12 of their staff came to one of our events last January, where we went really hard after the economic imperative for closing racial wealth gaps. And don't get me wrong, US Bank has been doing different work in diversity, inclusion, equity for a long time. But at this particular event, they brought a large group of folks to this event and came out of that saying, okay, we've got some different ideas. And I had been pushing hard around wealth, and in particular the CDC doing different work here. And over the last year, I've seen them really begin to pull layers back inside the organization, asking different questions around not only how can we hire differently, how can we retain differently, but how do we use our business, understand our business, what we do well in this work, and use that as a lever for change externally. If you saw their announcements last summer, you saw them come out strong to say, not only are we going to give grants, where every company was out yelling, here's what we're going to do. But like, not only are we going to give grants, we're going to increase those grants, but we're going to specifically focus on Black-owned businesses. And it was important to them when they called us to say, we know we want to say Black-owned. Like, we want to be very articulate about that, not just BIPOC-owned or low income, but we want to say that. And here's the number. But also saying, and we also want to do business with them. So it's one thing to say we want to give our charitable dollars. We also know we need to increase our procurement. Don't know how, but we want to increase that. And so the willingness to say, we know we have a journey to get there. So let's partner on having a consultant who can come in like the center to help us on that journey. They've also taken a specific focus on wealth in Black communities. And that's one of the things I appreciate is all the folks in our community are not in poverty. And so as a bank, they understood that, wait a minute, we're missing a segment of our economy by not acknowledging wealthy Black individuals as well and learning more about that population. So they brought in a consultant who's helped them really build out an understanding of the full diaspora of African Americans and begin to say, not only how can we serve them as customers, but also how do we help as we do serve as customers, how does that help also change the community? They've taken an interest in saying, how do we also invest in Black-owned banks to say that we as US Bank don't only need to thrive, but we're also going to invest in Black-owned banks such that that industry thrives and grows. A focus on Black home ownership. So a complete diversified, if you haven't seen the announcement, I'd be happy to send a link to that. It just came out today, but we've been seeing them go on quite a journey over the last year. That journey will continue for many years to come. It's got a lot of work to do, but to see a business that says, we know our core, it's financial services, but that core, that industry, and this is an industry that they are fully acknowledging has harmed Black communities significantly by wealth extraction, but through redlining significantly, and continues to, frankly. If you look at our indicators, you will see the banking industry is continuing to harm Black communities, but one that has taken it head on and said, let's be very intentional, let's be diversified in our approach, and let's be open in our approach, and let's bring in Black vendors to help us do that and help us understand where we can lean in, is one that I would elevate as a great example. There are many, many staff from coast to coast who are leaning in on this. So while you often see the headline, you see the 2 or 3 people, hear me, there are tons of people behind the scenes who are leaning in, who even when they see our name listed in this are pinging us like, okay, Tawanna, I'm in LA, I need your help with procurement. Can your team help me over here with this? I'm over here, can your team help me with the talent fair over there? So the number of people inside the business who are taking ownership, and that's what it takes. The chief diversity officer cannot do it alone. The chief procurement officer cannot do it alone. The CEO show can't do it alone. Everybody has to be all in on the strategy. And that's one I see where I have a lot of hope for this company really being all in on the strategy and really seeing some long-term sustainable results that, again, lead to equity and wealth in Black communities. Sorry for the long answer.
No, that was great. I'm just so sorry we run out of time because this conversation has been incredibly valuable. Thank you so much, Tawanna.
Thank you
for joining us. Really, really appreciate you, my dear. And I just want to thank all of you here who've participated today, and please stay engaged on this issue and do what you can in your sphere of influence. You know, YWCA St. Paul is focused on eliminating racism and empowering women, and we're really happy to bring conversations like this one to our community. It adds to the work we do in our programs on housing and supportive services, youth development, employment and workforce development, and health and wellness. Please visit our website if you'd like to learn a little bit more about that. And if you'd like to continue on this journey of learning and action, please join us for future conversations. We hold these conversations monthly, so please watch your emails and visit our website for more information. Thank you, Tawanna, again. Thank you to all of you, and have a good evening.